Hey everyone, James here, bringing you another Italian genre film review. Today I am going to be talking about a really interesting film for a number of reasons, and that is 1965's Libido. And this is really one of those underseen Gialli films, and this is actually the second time seeing it. I was inspired to watch it again after seeing that Unsung Horrors podcast I've mentioned in previous videos, at least in the Dragonfly for Each Corpse. They had brought it on, so I just wanted to watch the film again and listen to it and potentially bring it on here. And I thought, there's a lot to say about this film. I think it's really interesting because of who made it. I think it's also really interesting just to look at this in the time it comes out, because it's super early. It's really before what we know of as the Giallo film had really been established. This is 5 years before Argento would direct Bird with the Crystal Plumage, so he's still kind of dabbling around as a critic and a writer at this point, and he's only 25. But it's so interesting for a number of those reasons too. And so in that sense, some of the things that are in this film feel very much ahead of its time, and they're things that you would be like, that's just like opera, or it's just like Deep Red. So it had some of those things ahead of its time, but it's also fairly different, and I think it feels fairly different. There's a lot of reasons for that. First of all, it's in black and white, and I think it looks really good. But in that sense, I think this film kind of goes and bears some resemblance to some Gothic horrors, and I don't think it's really a Gothic horror like some of the Mario Bava films like Black Sunday or something like that. But it's a single location, which is kind of this big, massive house. Castle type thing, so it's kind of like this old opulent place where people hadn't lived in quite some time. Really cool set, but in that sense, those elements make it feel a little bit more like a Gothic horror, just because it's black and white, and we have this cool set, and it's kind of just a really small cast. And Gothic horror was also very, very popular in the 60s, before it kind of went out of fashion eventually, kind of going into the 70s. So when the Giallo really had its heyday, Gothic horror was very close to very late cycle, at least. And yeah, the other interesting thing is who's made it. So this was co-directed by Ernesto Gastaldi and Vittorio Salerno. Gastaldi in particular is probably a very familiar name to anyone who follows Giallo. He's probably easily amongst the 10 most important kind of creative figures behind Giallo, mainly known as writer. He's probably the number one writer associated with Giallo that isn't really known for directing films. So he wrote and worked a lot with Sergio Martino in particular, but he also wrote a number of Lindsay films. I think he wrote So Sweet and So Perverse. And he's definitely, I think, one of the best of the Gialli writers. And in that sense, the films... it's interesting just to think that a writer wrote this film, and I do think this film, some Italian films, you'll go into it, and you're going to be like, okay, this really has this incredible energy, and it feels like a lot of stuff is just very, very improvised. I feel like Pizzio Teschi in particular gives this feel, and I would say Umberto Lenzi often does that, where it's like, we're just going to go out, we're going to shoot it, and it doesn't feel like super pre-planned, and it can have this wonderful improvisational energy. This film doesn't have that. This film feels like everything was... pretty well thought out, and they knew what they were going to shoot. It's first time directing by him and Vittorio Salerno. I've actually reviewed another of Vittorio Salerno's films that he directed, No, the Case is Happily Resolved, which is a pretty decent Pizzio Teschi from the 1970s. So first-time directors, but it really doesn't feel like it. I think this film is quite handsome. It's black and white. I think it looks really good. Severin recently restored it and put out a Blu-ray of it. I did not see the Blu-ray, but it is available for free on Tubi to watch, and the transfer on there is quite good. So I'm guessing it's probably drawing kind of from the same source there. And it's, so I'd say the creative forces behind it are really good. Not to mention, it has a number of notable kind of Italian actors. Probably the most, the lead of this, playing a character called Christian, is Giancarlo Giannini, who, became internationally famous, kind of had some side roles on things that Hollywood films like Hannibal, Man on Fire, but really, for Gialli fans, Black Belly of the Tarantula, but really has had a very long and successful career. Anyways, I don't want to get too far before we go too far and get into the synopsis. So, Libido synopsis. A young man visits his ancestral home accompanied by his guardian and their wives, where he is plagued by the memories and influence of his murderous psychosexual father. So yeah, like a lot of Gialli that came ahead, and I think this is one of the areas where this really is ahead of its time. It sort of predicts kind of like this childhood trauma or just trauma in general, triggering kind of killing and stuff like that. So that's sort of this reoccurring theme throughout. And throughout the film, we're kind of questioning how sane is Christian? Is he going to be someone that's responsible for these murders or something like that? And Giancarlo Giannini does a very, very good job portraying him here. I think he's definitely one of the stronger points of this film. Playing the other male lead is the Italian Peter Lorre, who you would probably recognize from Blood and Black Lace, but he's in all kinds of stuff, a lot of Poliziotteschi's, some other Gialli too. Luciano Pagozzi, who just has one of those kind of short faces, like those very memorable faces, and yeah, I mean, it's very easy to see why he would be called the Italian Peter Lorre, because he looks a lot like Peter Lorre, and he's good here. He just has one of those presences and those faces that it's just always nice to see. So I'm always happy to see him in different films, and I think this is definitely one of his better roles too. Filling out the cast are Dominique Boucher, I think. Unfortunately, I scrolled past her name here, so I don't have it quite up in front of me, who was actually the most notable actress at the time. I learned this from the Fragments of Fear podcast, so she took up a good chunk of the not very big budget that went towards this film. And last up was Mara Merrill, who was married to Ernesto Gastaldi at the time. She was married to Ernesto Gastaldi until she passed away very recently. And she sort of plays Luciano Pagozzi's partner, his wife, who sort of gives off this very ditzy feel to it. And supposedly she was actually kind of in charge in a lot of the creative things behind this film as well. Supposedly responsible for some of the writing that came around for this. So kind of a overall kind of life collaborator with Ernesto Gastaldi. So I think she's quite good in this too. And she kind of gives one of the more unexpected character turns. So those of you that don't watch this channel before, I will spoil these films, so if you are really interested in giving this kind of a cold watch, I would just say go watch the film and then come back and re-watch this video. Before I get too far, I also wanted to shout out a couple of podcasts. First of all, Unsung Horrors, which is where I had the idea to kind of come back to this film. But there's also a really good Fragments of Fear, which is a Gialli-focused podcast on this film as well. So I do strongly recommend checking both of those out. There's also one on Giallo Ciao Ciao, which is pretty good. And generally speaking, everyone seems to really quite enjoy this film. So I think it's one of those that still has not been seen by a lot of people. Like, this is probably not even in the top 30 Gialli that people are going to seek out. But I do highly recommend it because it does come at such an interesting time. And I think it's a really, really solid film. Okay, so let's get into kind of perhaps maybe my only critique of this film. So supposedly this film's first cut was only 75 minutes. The agreement had been to bring this film at 90 minutes for commercial reasons, because you want it to be a certain length to play at a movie theater. And they basically padded it with a bunch of different close-ups and other stuff, like the Freud quote at the end, things like that, in order to get it to 90 minutes. The film, I think, moves all right. I think once you get to the last 25 minutes or so, and the last third act, it really kind of kicks into gear and really, really starts to move really fast. It kind of is sort of a slow burn, chamber piece, claustrophobic, and it's well done for the first 70 minutes. I will say, though, that knowing that there's a bit of filler and stuff like that, I do think it is a little boring for that reasons. I think stuff could move a little faster. So I would advise people that are watching this for the first time, that are expecting kind of your Argento Gialli, don't. This is far more of a psychological horror. It derives its kind of pleasure not from the set pieces and the kills, but more from kind of the psychological interactions between characters, the character motivations and stuff like that. So in that sense, this film is very much in the Le Diabolique mode, where kind of the characters are potentially motivated by inheritance and stuff like that. So in that sense, it kind of mirrors or it bridges the gap between kind of these two different character motivations that we usually see in Gialli. One, the inheritance, that was, I think, a little more common in these early Gialli, so things like So Sweet, So Perverse, and kind of like trying to get like a big pot of cash, as well as kind of course, the psycho killer, and this is where you get into the really absurd explanations. And so in that sense, this film actually does feature both in a fairly interesting way. So I think it's also kind of funny to look at it in that sense too. Sergio Martino also supposedly worked on this film as I think a production manager or production assistant, but a very, very bare bones cast. Mara Merrill supposedly was involved in some of the wardrobes, especially for the women. Ernesto Gastaldi did a lot of stuff too, beyond just writing and directing. So very much kind of everyone kicks in and stuff in order to make this film happen. Giancarlo Giannini at the time was not a particularly well-known actor, so he's actually competing with Franco Nero, which is crazy to think that probably like kind of your two iconic old Italian men that are still kicking around and occasionally appearing in Hollywood films were competing for this role back in time. So in that sense, I mean, this film is now 57 years old, so that's kind of crazy when you think about who they had to choose from. And I think he's very, very good in this role, but he probably didn't have to be paid a whole lot at the time. Another thing that's way ahead of its time, the toy and the lullaby, and just sort of that object fascination. It feels very, very Argento, and I don't know, it's hard to say if Argento had seen this film at the time. I'm guessing he probably did. This is one of those things where, you know, he might deny it, but it seems pretty on point. Of course, these things had happened before and stuff like that, but the kind of the toy object and stuff like that really does remind you of Deep Red once you start thinking about it. And the whole psychosis angle, where Christian is just worried that he's going crazy, and it sort of operates a little bit like a reverse like a gaslighting genre, except it feels different because in most of those kind of that genre of film or that subgenre of film, the person being gaslit, quote unquote, or being driven crazy is usually a woman. So this film stands out in the sense that Christian is a young man, and so it comes off and feels a little fresher, I think, as a result. So those are a couple things that did catch my eye here too. Vittorio Salerno is brothers to the great Italian actor Enrico Maurice Salerno, who they did want to cast for this film too in the Luciano Pagozzi role. He was, I think, not super interested in it, as it would have been a very small role for him, and he was kind of doing bigger stuff at this time. The score was done by Carlo Rustichelli, supposedly for basically free. And Rustichelli, already a pretty notable composer at the time, did a lot of Gothic horror scores. Also did the score for Blood and Black Lace, which I think is probably his most iconic score. Obviously a very, very great classic score. I don't think this one's quite up to that level, but I do think his sort of more old-timey style, rather than kind of like the Morricone, Bruno Nicolai style that would come later on, makes this film feel kind of very much in the 60s too, and it gives it a little bit of that Gothic tinge, as well as kind of the other elements of the black and white and the shadows and stuff like that. And yeah, this film just really showcases how much you can do with a lot of creativity, some good sets and things like that. Filmed in only 18 days, the set's really cool. We have a room full of mirrors and stuff like that, and the film just feels like it. They put a lot of thought into it in replace of kind of the budget that would have come. So I do think it feels like it doesn't feel like a high budget film, but it does feel like it uses its budget very, very well. You'd think with only 4 characters too that it'd be hard to figure out kind of how to generate tension and misdirects as far as like who is doing what to who, but the film does a good job. It's so much so that it even kind of hints and continually hints at sort of like his father perhaps not being dead because they never found a body and things like that. And if you have seen those Italian Gothic films, you'll know that those films do have supernatural elements to it. So while you're watching this, it might feel as if like a ghost might rise and stuff like that. So I think it does a really good job of kind of generating tension where you're like, I'm not sure exactly what's going on and who's doing what to who. This all being said, I do think this film is probably even better at a runtime of something like 75 minutes. I think that would be probably a pretty amazing runtime for this film. Just because I don't think it needs that full 90 minutes. So cutting stuff in, especially in that first hour, where you know, I don't think the padding that they added is too poorly done. I think it's actually pretty well done. That being said, I do think that if you shorten this film, I think it gets even better. So that's my personal 2 cents. That being said, I do think this is absolutely one of the best 1960s Gialli. I would definitely put it into my top 5, and I think in many ways this is a film that's far more representative of the 1960s Gialli than Blood and Black Lace by Mario Bava, and that film probably does a much better job of representing sort of the post-bird with the crystal plumage Gialli, but to show kind of like the 1960s stuff, this one and kind of the La Diabolique tinged ones, like the Lindsay ones, I think are, far more typical of that time period. So in that sense, really, really interesting to watch here too. And I think the last thing I will say is that they do a very good job with the set, and it makes it so it feels like a movie, not a play. And I think that's always kind of a thing that can happen, especially when you have kind of these single set films. But it does not go that way. So I think Gastaldi and Salerno did a good job kind of moving the camera and generating these images. And so yeah, I think probably not a top tier Gialli, but I do think it's kind of just beneath that, and both extremely notable. But I think it also just holds up as a pretty good thriller. One that you need to have a little bit of patience getting through at least the first hour or so. But I do think that hour is very well done, even though not a lot is happening. And I do think it really, really absolutely pays off in the last 25 minutes or so. So yeah, one last thing. For a film called Libido and a Giallo, it's pretty tame actually in terms of kills as well as sexual content. It does have those themes going on, but I do think this is a film where times are changing very, very fast. So if you do this film 10 years later, especially if you did it with like Lindsay or someone else, this film is probably sleazy as all hell. And personally, I would like that, but I do think that there is something to be said for kind of the more restrained approach here, and I do think perhaps this would appeal to a little bit of a broader audience as a result. So I think if you're knocking off 1960s Gialli, do a Blood and Black Lace, do this film, and maybe one of the early Lindsay, the Baker Lindsay Gialli, and perhaps Possessed too. I know that's another one. So yeah, one of the very, very few black and white Gialli as well. So yeah, thank you everyone for tuning in. Going to say the winner of this film, I'll give it jointly to Gastaldi and Salerno, who I think just did a really good job given the restrictions in casting and writing and directing. It's just a job very well done. Rating, going to give it an 8 out of 10. Just a very, very solid Gialli, and I really enjoyed it the second time around. So thank you everyone for tuning in. Let me know if you've seen Libido. Let me know what your other favorite 1960s Gialli films are. That might be a future video as well. And I will see you all next time.